This video covers JavaScript functions. The structure of this video is as follows: named JavaScript functions, anonymous JavaScript functions, passing JavaScript functions as variables, and the summary. All right, let's get started. Named JavaScript functions. This is a JavaScript function. A function is a block of code that will be executed when you call it. A function is written as a code block inside curly braces preceded by the function keyword. The code inside the function will be executed when you call the function. To call the JavaScript function, you have to type the function name with open close parentheses into the console or put it inside of a JavaScript script. When you call a function, you can pass along some values to it. These values are called arguments or parameters. These arguments can then be used inside of the function. You can send as many arguments as you like, separated by commas. To use the arguments inside of the function, you must declare the arguments as variables when defining the function. The variables and arguments must be in expected order. That is, the first argument gets assigned to the first variable. Sometimes you may want your function to return a value back to where the function was called. This is possible by using the return statement. When the return statement is executed inside of the function, two things happen. 1. The function will stop executing, and 2. The specified value, in this case x, is returned. You can assign the return value of a function to a variable. In this case, when function name returns the value x, it will be assigned to the variable returned value. Let's take a look at some examples. First, let's define a function. This function is called myFunction. Note that it does not return any values. Next, let's evaluate the function. Note that it returns undefined. This is because we did not specify a return value. Now, let's redefine the function and this time have it return a value. This time you can see that it has returned the value of 3, which is what we expected from the addition of 1 plus 2. Next, let's assign this return value to another variable. First, we assign the myFunction return value to the return value variable. Then, when we check the return value variable, we see that it is the number 3. If we type myFunction into the command line without parentheses, we can see the function code. This is useful when you are using a library like D3 or when you are writing your own functions. This lets you peer deep into the code of the function. Next, let's take a look at anonymous JavaScript functions. Anonymous JavaScript functions. An anonymous function is a function that does not have a function name. An anonymous function is commonly used when the function is used immediately after being defined. You can assign an anonymous function to a JavaScript variable. You can then pass this variable to other functions or call the variable as a function itself. To call an anonymous function that has been assigned to a variable, you just call it by using the open and closing parentheses. To see what the function is, you can type out the function name but not use open and closing parentheses. This will return the function code. Let's look at some examples. Let's define an anonymous function that returns the number 3. When we type this in, it returns an error. An error is returned because the function does not have a name that we can call. To fix this, we assign the anonymous function to a variable. In addition to allowing us to define an anonymous function, this also allows us to pass the function to other functions as a variable. To call and evaluate the anonymous function in the non-function variable, we just use the parentheses. As you can see, the number 3 is returned. We can also see the function code if we leave off the parentheses, and thus you can see the function code for the anonymous function. Next, let's take a look at passing JavaScript functions as variables. Passing JavaScript functions as variables. Earlier, We covered how you could call a function with an argument which would then be assigned to a value inside of the function. In this case, we are passing argument 1, which is assigned to var1 inside of the function. Because you can assign functions to variables, you can pass functions to other functions as variables, which means that in this case, we are passing function 1 as a variable to be used inside of function 2. Inside of function 2, var1's value will be the function 1. Let's look at some examples. First, let's make the function 1. You can see that we created a named JavaScript function that returned the number 7. Next, let's make a function that takes in one variable. To show you that you can pass functions around as a variable, this function will take one argument and then create an alert that tells us the argument's value. First, let's test it with the number 5. From the alert, you can see that the function 2 alerted us that the value we passed in was 5. Next, let's test it with the function 1. As you can see, we were able to pass in the function 1 function and have function 2 alert us of the code of the function 1. Now, the important part. Note, earlier we said that you had to assign the anonymous function to a variable to use it. This is true for the most part. When we can get away with not assigning an anonymous function to a variable is when it is passed directly to another function as an argument of that function. When we evaluate this expression, we see the anonymous function in the alert. As you can see, we were able to pass an anonymous function to another function as a variable without having to assign it to a name or a variable. This is because the function definition assigns the argument to a variable inside of the function for us. This will come in very handy when we start using JavaScript functions inside of D3 operators. And that is the basics of what you need to know right now of passing JavaScript functions as variables. The summary. This video covered named JavaScript functions, anonymous JavaScript functions, passing JavaScript functions as variables, and the summary.